the aspect of ecstasy, has always been problematic for Western scholars, and the aspect of ecstasy remains to be problematic for a lot of spiritual movements and teachers out there who doing their best to promote clean cut to nirvana, if we are to put it this way. Ecstasy is something which has this not only uneasy, unnerving, and where the rational approach kind of doesn't take us far, but the unruly nature of what ecstasy represents is what makes it into a taboo almost in spiritual circles. Considered to be an important consideration, inasmuch as in the age of postmodernism, when there has been an extraordinary explosion, we could say, of what prior to this age, many of the traditions that have been only subject to anthropological studies have become accessible by simple folk like ourselves. And we speak here to this fine balance between Etic and Emic approaches. Those of you who perhaps not familiar with the science of anthropology, just to say that anthropology as a study deals with this perspective, the so-called objective perspective, Etic, and so-called perspective which is unique to the very culture that is being studied, Emic. And there are propositions were made that depending on the needs or the goals of a particular study, one of the approaches should be preferred. And there is another perspective where these two, Etic and Emic, overlap, as it were, creating the possibility for, let's say, arriving with the third, what some call reality of the situation. It just happened, at least in my experience, that most of the teachings that came from the Orient, and as we know, everything that came from the Orient, one way or another, is linked to Vedic civilization. So it is linked to India. This has been acknowledged by all scholars without exception, even if the attempts were made to broaden that what Indian subcontinent represents as geographical location, hoping to find some other sources of influence. If not being prior, at least being on par or in parallel to its importance. These attempts have not bared much fruit. So therefore we are indebted to the repository of spiritual knowledge, and India simply as a civilization could be considered the Alexandria of spiritual knowledge of our time. As you know, Alexandria was the biggest library in the ancient world, where absolutely everything that was known prior to that was assembled in its vaults until it was gobbled by the sea. So India, therefore, is not just a country. It's an event in consciousness itself, no less. And of course, it's extremely diverse and extremely longevous. The simple fact that India today is continuation of a very ancient civilization which did not have a breakdown where it ceased to exist. Just for the sake of, making that example a bit more tangible, Indian civilization dates back to the time when Sumerian civilization and Egyptian civilization were in existence. Egyptian civilization is considered to be the longest in the Western world, the longest. It's made of the Old Kingdom, Mid Kingdom, and New Kingdom. The span of these kingdoms were sometimes measured in thousands of years, and that civilization perished a very long time ago. There was civilization which spoke Latin, right? That Christendom. Let's not confuse the fact that Abrahamic religions exist today in whatever form they are. The Christian civilization as such ceased to exist. The Byzantine, we no longer live, hopefully, in the world of the Byzantine Empire. There were many civilizations that rose and went into decline. In India, it is a continued affair. Something must be happening, something contributing to that, which is, well, not yet fully has been perhaps studied enough for it to be given that direct access to its longevity. And the reasons for that perhaps are rooted in the approaches, because the science of anthropology here, with some of the sister sciences which are more specific, let's say Indology, could be asked or could be considered as an attempt at giving an assessment of this particular culture from the outside perspective, that very definition of Indology. It was studied by those who came to India, and those who came to India were driven by great interests, of course, to get to know and give that critical, positive, of course, analysis of its culture. But it was mostly under the umbrella of that Etic approach. And it only in more recent years that the Emic approach, in other words, native, in other words, Emic approach stands in stark contrast to the more that objective, so to speak, approach, is that it is the insider perspective. So one need to, as it were, live among people, be initiated into their rights, live life in order to understand the governing principles. How many scholars were able to do that? We can count their names, maybe on one hand, I don't know, maybe that number increased. So why am I speaking to this now? Because it's very important. Now to make a leap into the world of spirituality. This Etic approach is, on the other hand, not ethic, Etic. Okay, there's no H. It's characterized by attempts at coming up with rational-based understanding of any given culture. And what is interesting, how inside spiritual circles, the very hermeneutic traditions that are known in India, whenever they were transplanted into the Western soil, they were not only subject to the Etic overview, but they were stripped of anything that we didn't want somehow here in the West to deal with, which did not feel somehow in alignment with that rational approach. So that sterilization, bleaching the system out of all unwanted, whatever colorful aspects that the culture may present with in its original form. These are very important considerations, and I'll leave that to you for your further studies and investigations. I call them simply, I dubbed that term, intellectual colonialism. That's all. Or intellectual imperialism. It's the same. We can use this interchangeably. This concept of intellectual imperialism goes as far as British teachers, for example, insist that the term Ananda is mistranslation, that the term Ananda means simply peace, some kind of like a platitude of being okay and fine and peaceful. This is the most, not the most, one of many telling examples of the sheer arrogance of making such declarations. It's as if within its own culture there is not enough proof to tell otherwise. And this is very important, because that's only an example here, not to settle some kind of disagreements here, but you can find many such approaches when interpretation was accompanied by continued misinterpretation. So, putting a pause here, I would like to make us this kind of leap into our containers, this particular room, our immersion. What has been very difficult and continues to be is to ascertain where this work belongs. It's to ascertain what this work has premises in. Why is it as it is? And in plain language speaking, why is it so messy, for example? Why doesn't it have a kind of like more of a aesthetically pleasing homogeneity that one can meet in some traditions? Like, for instance, at the time when the elites were taken over by Zen Buddhism, people in Switzerland were all clad in perfectly fitting kimonos, sitting on zazen properly, on beautifully ordered from Japan tatamis. Okay? I would love to have seen that room. But this room were reserved for meditations. Okay? And all the people from Europe, I'm talking about very old time ago, before Zen became popularized. Zen was first introduced into the United States and in Europe, particularly in Switzerland, among the upper classes. Why? Because the upper classes wanted to obviously have access to other forms of spirituality, which will be radically different from, well, quite frankly, you know, the ideas of the original sin and what have you, right? Kind of like. Other examples may be given. And I would love to, this is also a subject that I really, very close to me. Not that I consider myself to be an anthropologist in any way, none of that, but I've always loved history, I've always loved culture. Since, as far as I remember myself, I've always loved diversity and seeing how where diversity has the shared ground, in other words, that what would be here represented by this objective, let's say, point of convergence versus uniqueness of its self-expression. So it's interesting then in the case of some other cultures, where attempts also to impose that view, which was coined by I forgot his name, he's a very famous Palestinian writer, thinker of all time, Edward Said. He coined the term Orientalism. It's surprising that the term Orientalism, of course, existed, but he gave it the flavor for which it is known today, Orientalism, particularly tracing the history of the relationship between the West as a concept that formed around the time of the Greeks' resistance with Persian Empire. So the ideas of Orientalism were traced as far back as that, well before the rise of the Abrahamic traditions, Abrahamic religions that I meant, and that axis of resistance that were created by playing on the sentiments exemplified by the Holy Jerusalem. It's fascinating accounts. I mean, Edward Said, I was privileged enough to meet the man in my blooming early 30s in London without knowing the stature of this man. And these perspectives were examined also in relation to geopolitical repercussions of these ideas of Orientalism, because they were meant to subtly stigmatize people of otherness that do not belong to the culture that otherwise the civilized world has considered itself since the time of Hellenism, a concept coined by Aristotle himself, who has instructed Alexander the Great to give him that impetus following the untamable ambition of the young man to conquer the world. So that the conquering of the world is not about conquering the world, it's conquering the world of ideas. So the expansion of Western, forgive me, hegemony could be said began already then. You can find Hellenic coins in as far as my homeland. Back in the days used to be known as Bactria and Sogdiana. You can find sculptures of Buddhas wearing Greek tunics. You do not question that when you see them in the British Museum. You think that they are dressed in something Asian. No. The dress that Buddha wears in that particular sculpture is a Greek tunic. It has been confirmed by scholars. So, not to lose your attention, this is a long intro, or not quite long, but just like this, maybe bringing different strands together, because I feel just diving into the topic itself, which is highly esoteric, would not give us full justice unless we understand the cultural repercussions of how contemporary spirituality is taking shape, where the emphasis is being placed, and why our work remains to be not just on the fringes. So imagine there are fringes, periphery, and what would be after that? English-speaking people, please help me. God knows where, maybe, the word, the appropriate row, is where we can place this work. And it is why, interestingly enough, it's into the second decade that we carry this work. And the number of people in one single immersion did not increase. Okay? And I don't consider our work not being successful. But there is something to that it refuses to be popularized. This is to what I'm speaking to. It is refusing to become or take on a life of its own, if you see what I mean. Not that I'm speaking this in lamenting, but I would like to juxtapose here something which perhaps this attempt might change something. We might be on a precipice of bringing some much needed clarity in terms of what served as an inspiration for a lot of spiritual movements in the West. All of them, or majority of them coming from India, is offered in a lukewarm, diluted, and often perplexed and sometimes even twisted manner, thank you. So in other words, the way the teaching itself is carried through aborts the very, very heart of the teaching. Or, as it were, what's that? Throwing the baby with the bath water. So, with this kind of brief outline, the attempts were always made to bring these teachings, of course, and make them accessible. Starting with those who were in its days the carriers, the founders of spiritual movements. Every possible attempt was made to make these teachings accessible. For example, it's a very well-known fact among the senior members of Transcendental Meditation movement that in the earlier days, Maharishi's discourses were filled with Sanskrit terms and these concepts that essentially were not needed to be translated when he taught in India itself. But with advancement and expansion of the movement, there was this gradual withdrawal of the Sanskrit terms from the vocabulary, to such point that at some point all terms were translated into fitting equivalents in English, because Maharishi taught in English very lucidly as well. Of course, later on in life, the counterwave to bring this teaching back and give them the full, let's say, acknowledgement through ascertaining the teachings, how these teachings are understood to be in the tradition where they come from. But these were available only for select few. These works, these publications were never sold in bookstores, or this was just for those who were already dedicated their life of study. Whether this was similar or not, I personally, when delved into some of the, let's say, expositions of the spiritual movements, I found there were these attempts at simplifying often the teaching for it to make accessible. At times, this was seen as a really laudable, admirable attempt, more or less successful. At others, making it a subject of very easy misinterpretation and the popularization of, for example, that what represents here by the Kundalini now takes us to a place of complete and utter jungle when it comes to the understanding of the neurophysiological transformation of consciousness. So, one aspect, and this is maybe I brought that example with the term Ananda, which by the way translates as the root of the term Nanda, means rejoicing. Rejoicing. And Ananda means uninterrupted rejoicing. So the aspect of ecstasy, has always been problematic for Western scholars, and the aspect of ecstasy remains to be problematic for a lot of spiritual movements and teachers out there who doing their best to promote clean cut to nirvana, if we are to put it this way. Ecstasy is something which has this not only uneasy, unnerving, and where the rational approach kind of doesn't take us far, but the unruly nature of what ecstasy represents is what makes it into a taboo almost in spiritual circles. Yet if I add here the side note, when I, for example, was told about that how good it would be for me when I became TM meditator, Transcendental Meditation Meditator, for me to take an advanced course, the TM CD program, in some private gathering in London. This was just like suggested by a senior person who knew Maharishi, and this was sometimes in mid-90s. Of course, I was very, very curious, and somehow inside I knew one day I would attend this program. And in just asking, inquiring about it, and then reading just what was available in the pamphlet of the local TM center, gave me an idea that it's a some kind of like very, very internal process that would render myself, right, as someone who would attend, into this a more evolved being, as the promise goes. Like I would just, attending this program, go through it, I would become, well, bigger, larger in every way. This would be like a cherry on the cake of life lived already at the time, if you put it that way. And it never dawned on me for a moment the actual somatic side of it, the physical side, the messy side, and of course, the ecstatic side of it when I attended the program. So in other words, the concept, the map, right? It's like you go somewhere and you plan your trip and you look that, whatever that today called that the internet now, so TripAdvisor? Yeah, what's the most trusted, I don't know, today? Like back in the days, there will be 4-door, there will be rough guide, there will be these hardcore copies you purchase in the shop at the time when I traveled, and you look at that, you're planning to go whatever country, you want to know what to expect, where to, kind of like, that's what it used to be, like rough guide for any country, 4 doors travel, a companion, something. So you read about that, and all this is in a conceptual state, all in a state of, yeah, okay, they tell you about the climate, yeah, climate, okay, yeah, temperatures, right, okay, rainy season, monsoon, and then you go there, and then when you go there, then the physicality of experience and whatever is written in the, not just pales in comparison, that guide itself gets soaked and basically disintegrates eventually from the humidity, what have you, right? Your laptop warps out of shape, like from the heat and the humidity. Your leather gets, your leather disintegrates, rancid and returns back to biodegrades itself throughout one rainy season. Yeah, certainly in Ecuadorian waters, that's what's happening. This example is not at all far-fetched how I personally have experienced that, what was like I considered that this is how I will expand in consciousness. I thought expanding in consciousness was to attend course, there's some kind of well-guarded, perhaps even mythical, secret methodology is given, and you just like whoosh. Well, yes, it was all the whoosh, but it came with a lot of whoosh. So that whoosh is what we set to discuss here. This whoosh is what our work is known for.